Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 13 of the Garrote podcast. I am your host, Chingachgook. Today's episode marks a very auspicious milestone. Its significance directly emerging out of the trials and tribulations endured to bring the project to some semblance of a cadential repose, because it is the finale of the podcast's first season. Before we directly immerse ourselves into the content of today's episode, I believe it necessary to take a brief few minutes to review where we've been and where we are now. To begin with, I want to extend my deepest gratitude and sincerest thanks to you, the audience, for accompanying us through the laborious forays into meta that has been the very essence of what the previous 12 episodes, in the end, turned out to be. I am fully aware that we live in a world driven by clicks, likes, and shares, so much so that the difference between financial prosperity and financial ruin hinges upon them. And with that often comes the stereotypical platitudes of online content creators thanking their audiences as a thinly veiled gimmick to ensure retention and growth of those aforementioned clicks, likes, and shares. Given the backdrop of this zeitgeist, it is not immediately obvious to me how best to imbue this soliloquy with the gravitas it requires. Nevertheless, I feel impelled to emphasize a singular key point. Although we may never meet, although I may never know who you are, or indeed, whether you are even out there to bear witness to these words, your curiosity and willingness to endure the burden of converting unarticulated knowledge into freestanding claims is both significant and meaningful. Characteristics that are both derived from and injected into the final product of this project by virtue of your willingness to listen. Verily, from the perspective of the one creating this content, it is the very substance of hope, the wellspring of my thankfulness to you all. Regardless, let us not become overly sidetracked on this point. I will return to elucidate further on the subject in due course. As I have already mentioned previously in episode 1, the Garrote podcast seeks to be an analytical toolkit, a repository for axioms, terms, and their definitions that, in turn, enable and empower the generic individual to scrutinize and better understand the world around him, resulting, ideally speaking, in the construction of individualized positions on a myriad of different topics, issues, and questions that the generic individual can both explain and defend on his own terms. Given this explicitly stated objective, we must be very clear on one point. The task that the Garrote set out to achieve is far from complete. A season finale by no means implies an end to the podcast itself. On the contrary, the first 12 episodes merely lay the basic groundwork for an increasingly complicated network of content and ideas. This should come as zero surprise, given my statements in episode 1, combined with our repeated exhortations to listen to the episodes in sequence throughout the first season. Nevertheless, content creation must delineate scopes and thresholds somehow, so that one may objectively demarcate progress in any meaningful sense. In that spirit, although these terms, now brought into articulated knowledge, are but a drop in the proverbial bucket, they nevertheless constitute a sufficient starting point worth acknowledging on its own merit. In light of all these things, we now approach a very natural follow-up question that asks, what kind of episode would best provide the cadential repose befitting a season finale? Throughout the duration of Season 1 and its long and arduous production, I meditated extensively upon this question. For those of you who have made it this far, the importance and influence of Dr. Jordan Peterson and his work upon both Howard and myself ought to be patently obvious at this point, which is exactly where the inspiration for today's episode arose. Given Dr. Peterson's prominence in the Anglosphere, probability dictates that the chances of either Howard or myself speaking with the good doctor on any sort of long-form basis are essentially slim to none. This stands in stark contrast to the immensity of his empathy for the suffering of others. A man who, despite raging popularity that elevates him upon a pedestal, still cares for the individual supplicant who only has a window of 10 minutes or less to approach him at something like a book signing or lecture tour. But what if such limitations did not exist? What if, as I told Howard when he asked me about the format of today's episode, Dr. Peterson was sitting across from you, listening, attentive, and unrushed? The image that arose in my mind's eye in response to this question was an extension of the macabre allegory I described back in episode 1. The allegory in which the slow, excruciating death by Garrote represents the desperation under which we brought this podcast into being. In the context of this metaphor, awaiting the life-depriving constriction to set in, what if your final words could be heard by none other than Dr. Peterson himself? A man not necessarily empowered to save you, but entirely and sincerely willing to listen. On the basis of this logic, itself somewhat reminiscent of the sonata form, given the reemergence of the podcast's namesake, I believe it is appropriate and tasteful to close out this first season with a pair of open letters to Dr. Peterson, one from Howard and another from myself. At this juncture, I want to take a brief moment to openly express my gratitude to Howard for not only accompanying me on this journey, but also bearing an equal load of the desperate fatigue through which we had to push. There is simply no feasible way this podcast could have approximated anything resembling completion without his contributions, both in content as well as technical prowess. Although our respective origin stories are fundamentally different, having come from very contrasting worlds, I am blessed to be able to call him my brother in arms throughout the years of trials and tribulations we have battled together. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, and above all, Dr. Peterson, if you're out there, I am pleased to now cede the floor to the individual I am honored to call my best friend, Mr. Howard Roark.
Dr. Peterson, the strain under which I'm speaking to you is both immense and unarticulated. My difficulty with you is of the refreshing kind. I'm pleased to say that, unlike a plethora of other interactions that I have with various individuals in my life, my difficulty with you is not something like, did you know that there is even a such thing as an alternative to pathology? And not only that, but there is an alternative to pathology that is better than pathology, which makes it even worth pursuing. Establishing that a better option exists, even generally, is where a lot of the lines of the interactions that I have with individuals get drawn. No, you understand that there is a such thing as better. My difficulty is somewhere else, somewhere in between articulated knowledge and the unknown. My challenge shifts from establishing the fundamental that better exists, obnoxious as that phrasing is going to be for me later, to what is the best thing to say next. The strenuousness of my ability to speak with you is also a natural consequence of an internal conflict. On one hand, saying nothing to you in this context would be a catastrophe, an egregious error. And on the other hand, if I speak rashly, and you conclude after hearing me speak that I am just another confused moron in your periphery, I would also consider that a catastrophic failure, particularly at a personal level. I would vastly prefer, despite the risk of being categorized as a moron, while also perfectly recognizing the possibility that I might be a moron, and I don't think I am, but I would rather present myself as someone who can demonstrate to you, behaviorally, that not everyone that listens to you is a moron. And maybe I can be an example of that. Now, that would be quite a claim, especially because I said behaviorally, which indicates that I would need to have something to show for myself. So, what do I have to show for myself, and how does this distinguish me from this problematic category called moron that I'm so emphatically trying to avoid? As a brief citation as well, I remember when you answered a dull interview question at the end of the 2018 GQ, I'll say hostile interview. The question was, what is most important to you in life? And your answer was, not being stupid. Now, this brings me to a meta point that I need to come back to. However, the meta point is something in the direction of, Dr. Peterson, are you prepared for someone to show up and to demonstrate and embody that he knows exactly what you're talking about? Do you know what it looks like in the world for someone, or maybe even two people in this instance, to show up and say, hey, Dr. Peterson, we're doing that? Are you prepared for what that looks like in the world? It does not seem to me, based off of my observations of your work, that you have a lot of direct help, I will say. And you have a lot of work, even just looking at your published lectures, to the point where your lectures are starting to get folded back into chaos simply due to their quantity. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of curating that content, but this brings me back to my point. You've shouldered considerable responsibility in the context of archetypes. You need someone who can dig underneath where you have managed to go. You have a mantle, and someone is going to carry that work forward. This person needs to be capable. This person needs to be able to understand the archetypes. And he needs to be willing to shoulder that responsibility to carry this work forward. It is not clear to me whether I meet those conditions or not. However, the ambiguity of whether I'm capable and whether I ought to be the man or one of the men to shoulder the responsibility of carrying your work forward deeply disturbs me because it implies potential. A potential where this is something that I'm going to need to do, or at the very least, contribute to in some meaningful way. That is, before the logos gets involved. At this point, before I talk about the logos, I want to tie two previous points together. I spoke about wanting to not be a moron, which implies the question of how do you tangibly do that? One way to do that would be to provide a proper complement. The claim being something in the direction of, if a person is a moron, then this person cannot provide a proper complement. This person can provide a proper complement, therefore, I do not know what this person is, but whatever this person is not a moron. Similar to, if Fido is a dog, then Fido is a mammal. Fido is not a mammal, therefore I do not know what Fido is, but whatever Fido is, he's not a dog. Then, whether the if-then statement is true depends on what I mean by proper complement, which links to the second idea, contributing to your work in a meaningful way. So, not being a moron and contributing in a meaningful way are getting synthesized into what it means to give a proper compliment. I'll say it this way. You receive a lot of compliments. You yourself describe these compliments frequently with the genuine gloriousness that accompanies them. Someone who says, "I really appreciate your work has really helped me to straighten out my life." That is not inherently a problem when someone says that, obviously. I agree with your evaluation that those types of comments are fantastic. However, what if I could do better? What if I could encapsulate everything in a comment like that, plus more? What if, as a way to demonstrate a strong compliment, I could contribute to your work in a meaningful way? My compliment is more than saying, "Thank you for what you have done." There is more at stake here than saying, "Thank you for giving me more material to consume." What if I could say that I respect your work so much that it needs this to be even better? And I already have this. This is not potential work. It is already done. I want to demonstrate what it looks like to carry your work forward. At this point, I better have something to back up these words, and I do, but maybe one path to not being a moron? Give a proper compliment. How do you give a proper compliment? Contribute something useful to the field in question. So then, what is this demonstration? The citation I'm going to reach for in this context comes from episode 3 of this podcast, published in December of 2022, entitled The Logos. Now, you understand that the logos is a fundamental term in the context of archetypes. For a long time, Dr. Peterson, I have watched you encapsulate the borders around this term, the logos. You frequently describe the logos as something in the direction of X, in the Genesis series, for example. It is a subcategory of unarticulated knowledge. And fair enough, this is extremely complicated and you need to get it right. However, you provide descriptions, not a definition. As episode 3 points out, the logos is not the source itself. The logos is used by the source. That is to say that the logos and quality in the Robert Pirsig sense are not the same. Quality in the Robert Pirsig sense, and I say in the Robert Pirsig sense for the sake of brevity, the idea of quality goes beyond Pirsig. Anyone that has read Pirsig ought to understand that, and I know that you read Pirsig because it's in your list of recommended books, and I've heard you refer to Pirsig in your lectures. Quality, in the Pirsig sense, cannot be defined, sure, but the logos can. That does not mean that the task is easy, but I have this image of your working to encapsulate the area around something. And then someone walks up that understands what you're doing, reaches into the center of what you have indicated the general location of, and pulls out the very thing that you've been trying to encapsulate, but in an intact form. You've been working to indicate the location of the logos. It is somewhere over here. It's something like this. And then I, for example, or Chingachgook, reach into the location of where the logos should be, pull it out, and show it to you, saying, "Dr. Peterson, is this not what you're looking for?" I have, since episode 3 of this podcast, tested the extracted definition of the logos against everything that I've been able to find in my personal interactions, in the subsequent episodes of the podcast. Every time I hear you or someone else say the logos, I'm testing to see if this definition still holds. It has not moved. It explains a lot. It does not seem to me to be an idea that you would easily forget. The definition being, the logos is the most reliable process by which words are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance. Dr. Peterson, is this what you've been looking for? Earlier, when I was speaking about the task of merely establishing that the idea of what is best exists, when the idea of the logos is established for an individual, one of the next layers past that immediately is the idea that two individuals can be using the logos at the same time. And it is possible that these two individuals are both using a process through words to determine the best possible option given their circumstances, respectively. And they could even be doing that together, using dialogue. A situation in which two people are actively using the logos together in dialogue became the content of episode 4, for example. I do not think that it is outlandish to claim that you could use people in your life that are concerned with maintaining a connection to the logos consistently. Not sometimes. And, of course, there is a category of individuals that fight to never connect to the logos, and that is definitely not an empty category. But I would also claim that a consistent consideration of the question of what is best, even if you do not know the answer, to merely ask the question of what is best at an individual level, enables functional friendship to occur. To say to, quote, make friends with people who want the best for you, which is Rule 3 from 12 rules, is a descriptive extension of this idea. The idea that it is possible for two individuals to use the logos in dialogue and thereby determine the best possible option for either or both parties, and that the outcome is good, and that the outcome is consistently good. If I have your interest, then I think that there are other terms and definitions from this podcast that you are going to want to use. Besides episode 3, I would genuinely recommend all of them. But if you need curation, then I would speculate that you would have immediate use for the terms and definitions of meta, tangibility, problematic tiger move, perpetual interest, and Holden mode, which would be episodes 2, 6, 10, and 12, respectively. Also, there was another definition of one of your terms, the fog, that occurred in episode 11. To reiterate, I want to give you a compliment by offering you something that you can use in the field of study that is your perpetual interest. You do seem to have a perpetual interest, an area of study about which you always want to know more and of which you never get bored. From episode 10. Somewhere in the direction of the study of archetypes. I've heard you describe the grip of your needing to understand the history of the 20th century, which I would argue perhaps is a subcategory of understanding the archetypes for how to live properly and improperly, and sometimes properly. I will also say that an individual who seeks to oppose the logos has a strategic incentive to destroy hierarchies. If the logos is concerned with the best possible option in any given set of circumstances, a very effective way to oppose that would be to say, no hierarchies. No hierarchies, no best. And then, as reference to the Book of Wisdom, we'll see what the righteous man has to say about that. Something I said earlier was the question of, do you understand what it would look like in the world for someone to actually achieve what it is that you are talking about? And now is the time when I need to come back to that. Like my co-host has said in the past, the work that we have done so far is a stepping stone toward a greater set of expositions and conclusions. There is a lot more work to do, a lot of chaos to order, assuming we are alive. But the future of what that looks like, the direction that that goes, has something to do with what it looks like for an individual to remain connected to the logos consistently. What was once considered orientation can now be considered a principle, which can be embodied in practice. The phrasing of strive for and try to start to get removed from certain platitudes, which either become tangible or are discarded accordingly, and decisions are made properly accordingly. To perhaps provide a brief allegorical example, someone who tells me to, say, strive to try to get an A in a course, or perhaps to strive to try to be honest with the woman that you are dating. At the point where I approach this person and I say, I received an A in that course you were talking about. Generally, in practice, that person does not know what to do. My getting an A? That was not supposed to happen. I was just supposed to try to get an A, implying that I should try and fail. But when I didn't fail, the tune changed. Commonly, and to my surprise, this type of person will become visibly upset at my achieving what was not supposed to be possible. Is that how someone would respond who is connected to the logos? No. Do I think that you are going to be upset with me? No, I don't think so. But unlike the individuals telling me to strive to get an A, you are in the practice of generating alternatives. At the moment, I have the image of someone walking along the edge of a cliff. I'm trying to describe something in the direction of what is on the other side of the cliff without falling off of the cliff. It is a narrow path, and there is a lot on the other side of that cliff that I am not going to be able to talk about in this context with you. But the world seems to be moving from the 20s to the 30s again, like a century ago, and with terrifyingly unresolved meta. You are not the only one that wants a better way. Meta, by the way, is that which connects any given set of particulars, which is from episode 2 of this podcast. I'm glad that your health has recovered. Your willingness to perceive my words is accompanied by my sincerest gratitude. May you maintain your connection to the logos. The question of what is the best option given your circumstances. Always.
Dr. Peterson. Delving deep into the nebulously murky vapor within which unarticulated truth lurks is a process with which, judging by the extensive corpus of your published work, I am sure you are intimately familiar. And by virtue of that, it is with a certain degree of solace that I commit these hazy utterances to record, regardless of however precipitous such a position may be. For years now, since the days of my youth, when I was a much younger man than now, I have done incessant battle against Tiamat in a desperate attempt to forestall the eternal power of her primordial chaos from devouring everything around me. In truth, it has been a lonely war, for, with few exceptions, it has been a war that I have prosecuted alone. You know full well, perhaps better than any other man, the capacity for chaos to conceal itself as it draws near, coiling, as does a serpent, before wreaking havoc upon the unsuspecting, though their blindness, truth be told, is often a choice. Regardless, the net result of such circumstances is that they do not understand my struggle, because they do not see what I am fighting against, because they do not see what stares at them in hunger from the shadows. Insofar as the visionless are concerned, I take my tomahawk to fight nothing more than silent phantoms. The seasons passing from one to the next in a never-ending cycle, and in my age, my bones grow weary from the travails of that seemingly eternal fight, and few are the friends who look on and truly understand the flood that Tiamat promises to bring. From the days of my boyhood youth, I always understood that the linear time distinctions of past, present, and future were artificial delineations, though for much of my life, I lacked the ability to clearly explain what that exactly meant. Later, as I grew older, with the popularization of films like Interstellar and Arrival, I would see, albeit in narrative form, the idea of the fundamental oneness of time, captured by the dramatists who created these works of art, reflecting what I already knew to be true. And with such a shamanic understanding of the universe comes the inescapable verdict that the future, no matter how distant, is in fact not actually later, but rather here and now. And as such, we as individuals are behooved to act accordingly. But again, you know this, and your lectures on Genesis reveal this to be the case. You yourself correctly articulate that the entire reason why sacrifice makes any coherent sense at all is because one has the ability to do good and provide value to one's future self. This is at the core of such poignant aphorisms as, "The future is something that can be negotiated with." In other words, one's future self is no less real simply because it is not here yet. But Dr. Peterson, I implore you to gaze upon what naturally follows from that and behold how such a principle reaches out to touch all things. The attribute of "is not here yet" in no way detracts from some things or someone's realness, trueness, or authenticity. It is within this context, which is so intimately central to the wisdom around which Howard and I have seen you revolve, trying so hard to impel your general audience to comprehend, that I may speak of my son, who, like all things in the singular oneness of time, is no less real simply because he is not here yet. It is for this reason that the minds of the palefaces always become confused when I tell them that I slew my own child. I do not believe it lost on you that the moment of conception may not be the lower threshold for what constitutes reality. Indeed, the demands of proper sacrifice, insofar as they are connected with the potential for a better tomorrow, require us to deeply fathom the depths of the future's profundity and the realness that entails. Was the failure to conscientiously perceive that profundity nestled at the core of Cain's error, and why the Creator ultimately rejected his sacrifice? I often wonder whether Cain's failure to give the judgmental future its due, assuming that indeed was the central problem, arose from his failure to consistently practice the sacrament of sacrifice properly, as is the case with many things throughout the course of our individual lives. Regardless, standing in the shadow of such meditations, I do cautiously take a modicum of comfort in the conviction that, in my seemingly perpetual struggle against Tiamat, I at least have a lifetime of practice behind me. This is fundamentally what I mean whenever I cryptically speak about the death of my son, during the select few times over the years in which I would even broach the subject, and then only to my most trusted confidants. Like Abraham, a respective patriarch of his own people, I too ascended the dreaded hill to sacrifice my own son. The key difference being that I never heard the angel of the Creator tell me to stay my hand. That image of laying my boy on that sacrificial pyre is a vision that I have carried in my mind's eye every day of my life since I set out to keep Tiamat at bay. By pursuing this path, each step I take embodies the fearful and trembling faith that it is the Logos to which I run, and hence, by extension, give chase to the good. But the future, as you say in your lectures, is a judgmental father, and as such, time will ultimately determine whether my sacrifice is deemed sufficient or whether the Creator will find fault and resolve that my people shall be washed away from the face of the earth. It is with equally fearful and trembling faith, should he ultimately consign my tribe to decimation and destruction, that I cling to the hope that I at least retain enough strength to not become Cain. However, it remains an unfortunate set of circumstances that the wages of indefatigably pulling order out of chaos hitherto remain little more than universal indifference. Indeed, the silent darkness of the apathy of others under which we labor is the power that strengthens the suffocating grip of the garrote, which, in itself, is a perpetually painful reminder that my posterity is dead. Now, there do exist a large number of individuals, particularly among the palefaces, who would be tempted to hijack the concept of universal principles as a weapon to castigate my central concern for my tribe, as a sort of narrow jingoism. However, these individuals typically fail to realize that the capacity for human striving is not infinite. You have frequently instructed your students to narrow their objectives to a scope that they can manage in order to enable tangible action. Such is the logic behind the now laconically infamous apothegm that demands, "Clean your room." Along with this, you frequently reference Solzhenitsyn and his monumental work to demonstrate that meaningful change for the better begins with the individual, and only then spreads out to one's family and then community. Your guidance seeks to inspire a generation of lost souls to courageously take on levels of responsibility that they can manage to bring order out of chaos and pursue the good. In that regard, saving my clan and my tribe has been the threshold of what I could manage. My circumscribed attempt to aim for the proverbial dirt, as you so often say. For the dark silence that surrounds us taught me that assuming my efforts would be valuable to the oft-vaunted generic individual would be no small measure of hubris, such as I have believed for many years now. But even under such limited parameters, the desperate fight to keep my tribe away from Tiamat's clutches is already costing me everything. In your lectures on Genesis, you say, "The good father is one who is willing to sacrifice his child to the ultimate good." But Dr. Peterson, I ask you the same supplicating question that Howard brought before you. Do you truly understand what that would look like? Consider for a moment that it is perhaps the case that inherent to the uncompromising pursuit of the good is the requirement for man to sacrifice his own children, that the relationship between these things is far from incidental. Just as the future is judgmental, so too does Tiamat possess a sense of pride, and she is far from delighted when man effectively wields the Logos to halt her chaotic, flood-like power, and we underestimate the magnitude of her strength at our own peril. Everything in this life comes at a cost. Is this why there are so few who willingly and unwaveringly go to confront her? I do not think it unreasonable to postulate that Tiamat's modus operandi, when confronted with the light-bringing Logos, is to steal away the children of the braves as a form of vengeful comeuppance for the audacity of intercepting her deluge. before retreating back into the dark abyss of the unknown, and thereby securing herself some form of victory, because there will be nobody left to follow the warrior who stopped her the first time around when the brittleness of old age finally comes to claim him. I do not wish to believe that the wages of accepting responsibility to pursue the logos and push into the chaos of the unknown is little more than the unfaltering constriction of the Garrote. But rejecting such a belief, given the totality of the circumstances, would be more of an act of faith as opposed to bona fide conviction. I will continue to face Tiamat's chaotic terror, but as my breath begins to grow weak, I cannot help but sometimes wonder to what end, if I am indeed doomed to never be able to guide and encourage my son, or anyone else for that matter, to do the same. Nevertheless, I do not wish this soliloquy to devolve into a despondently solipsistic requiem, not least of all to a man who journeyed into the bowels of hell and perpetual physical torment, and still managed to survive. Indeed, the example you set in the face of such unspeakable trial remains one of the few vestiges of hopeful light as we continue to scream into the silent dark. I remember distinctly, years ago, not long after your daughter Michaela posted to YouTube a granulated webcam video announcing to the world your precarious physical condition after your inexplicable disappearance following an initial meteoric rise, that Howard and I were seated around our modest dinner table, sequestered in place late at night during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, mutually discussing our concern for your well-being, particularly in light of everything you had accomplished even just up to that point. The sentiment we shared that evening was clear. The world could not afford to lose you. Not yet, for there were too many people who desperately needed the work that you had, and indeed still have, yet to do. The impending potential for such an untimely death shook the world to its core. And yet, seemingly by the miraculous grace of Providence, you prevailed. Later, as your health slowly began to return, you would give an interview with Chris Williamson, in which he would say, "If the option had been there, I, and probably a lot of other people, would have happily taken our share of your suffering over the last year if it somehow would have helped, as a thank you for how you've helped us." Measured from the time of this writing, several years have already passed since that interview, and in all likelihood, many more will pass before you receive this message, assuming that such a day ever comes at all. However, I hope that, despite the passage of this time, Mr. Williams's words have not grown faint in your memory, for they are without question the most cogent and truest observation ever spoken to you in public, and a sentiment that I continue to hold dear, even despite my current circumstances. I am Chingachgook of the Mohicans, and though I do not know what will come of this message, thus cautiously set adrift into the void, or upon whose shores it will alight, I do so in the hope that it will be a beacon, showing that we were once here, waiting and walking with the Logos. And so, Dr. Peterson, should these words ever reach you, O savisuli, liao empona, esina, ekulupu olensina, lon, masuleale. May the Creator eternally bless you and keep you and your loved ones, wherever on this earth you may be.